What's going on, mi gente? We're just a couple of days away from the World Cup qualifier starting, and we're here to break down every single nation in the conmebol region, so stay tuned. What's going on, mi gente? Today, I'm joined by Andy Deossa from Yahoo Sports to talk a little bit about Colombia. Right before the qualifiers, it's a new campaign, so let's get right into it. Andy, thank you for joining me. How you doing today, brother?
Doing pretty well, man. Can't believe it's already September. The World Cup felt like it was just yesterday. So much has happened since then, and now we're back to talk about some qualifiers.
It's crazy. It's crazy. First thing I want to talk about the qualifiers before we go into Colombia. I want to talk, or I want to know your opinion on the new format. Because for me, personally, I've been saying, for me, the conmebol qualifiers are the best, I think, in the world. But the new format and us now having 6.5 spots kind of takes away from that, in my opinion.
I agree. I think that the fun of it was how tough it was to qualify in South America specifically, because teams like Brazil and Argentina basically take up those first two spots anyway. As a country that didn't obviously qualify last year, you're kind of happy that you have a better chance. But you're right. I think the extended field kind of takes away from just what we know. And it's the same conversation of like change is not always a great thing. And you see it around all different sports. They're trying to figure out how to, I guess, incentivize certain things. NBA is doing in-season tournaments, and MLB is trying to change rules, and college football doesn't know who wants to be in what conference. So it's just like one of those things that you knew was probably going to happen in terms of money for FIFA. But yeah, I liked it how it was, man. I think it was just so much fun, and it's unfortunate that it has to change.
All right. I like that. So let's get right into it. Y'all didn't make it to the World Cup. Obviously, we all know that. Y'all finished in 6th. Only lost out by 1 point. But I think the biggest thing was the results, right? 5 wins, 8 draws, 5 losses. Those draws. Talk to me a little bit about what happened last campaign and what needs to be worked on this campaign.
It was very weird, a process with different coaches and some type of turmoil inside the locker room that never really came to light, and then kind of trying to get those players back in the mix for the home stretch that never ended up panning out to what they wanted it to be. It was messy from the beginning. It really was. And it was almost shocking that Colombia actually moved it along and was still kind of in contention. But we talk about it all the time. I mean, talent-wise, they should be able to compete and have no issues. So it was a lack of, I think, just honestly, camaraderie was one thing that hurt the team in that middle stretch where players were in and out and there were so many reports coming out about certain things. Then they just couldn't score. And that's as simple as it gets. I mean, you could try to break down this sport in so many different ways, and people do great jobs in analyzing tactics. But if you have strikers and talented players that are scoring around the world that, are in front of the net with a national team jersey with a chance to qualify, and they can't put the ball in the net, that's an issue. It's as simple as it gets. There's no other reasons and other ways to look around it. And at the end of the day, it just wasn't good enough. Even some of those draws, might have benefited us in the end, even if we would have drew in that game against Peru and Barranquilla, which we both were at. But at the end of the day, it wasn't good enough. And even if Colombia were to make it to the World Cup, it wouldn't have been deserved because they just weren't playing well. And that's as simple as it gets.
Yeah, seven games, I believe, without scoring, right? That's tough. Now, it's a new process, right? Nestor Lorenzo, who was the assistant to Peckerman, which is, I think, one of their more successful periods in the history of Colombian football. He comes on. Now, there's obviously a beginning of a change, I feel like. I don't know. You could explain a little bit more for me on what you think, right? Obviously, there's still Cuadrado, James, Mina, certain players, but there's also players like Duran from the youngster from Aston Villa, who I think has been exciting so far in the first couple matches that we've seen. Tell me a little bit more there.
Yeah, it's a necessary change. I think with World Cup process, you kind of failed to forget how long of a gap it is. And 4 years in soccer seems like a lot more than it might really be, especially for certain players in their career, moving around, trying to find teams, trying to find playing minutes, trying to find health and stay out of injury. So it's a necessary process. I don't want to say it's starting from new, because like you said, there is a mix of those veteran players who we'll talk about later, I'm sure, but it's important to be able to kind of bring those new kids in the fold. And the thing I like about Nestor Lorenzo is that he was around the team and he kind of knows you know, the pool that he's working with, where when he was helping with Peckerman, there was a certain group of players who were already older, but they were still in the mix. And now it's like, all right, let's bring these new kids in, but let's not start from zero, because Colombia doesn't have to start from zero. The talent's there, and with the young talent comes the mixture of those vets. And I think that he has the right mentality, the right idea. From what I've seen in the friendlies, I think he has the right idea of going forward. And I also, you know, I think he knows the pressure. Like, this is not an easy situation to walk into, to get a team like this to qualify coming off of not qualifying. It's not an easy thing. And I'm already listening to journalists in Colombia and the reaction just on the call-up list. And I'm like, oh my goodness, man, like this, I don't think anybody's ever happy with any type of call-up list anyway in any country, but it's a real pressure situation. So I like him. I mean, you can't judge too much off of a few friendlies, but from what I saw and certain players that I've seen in the mix, I think that he has the right mind to move forward, and hopefully that's the case.
The dramas of conmebol. I mean, all right. So you already mentioned, right, that when he was the assistant to Peckerman, they already had these certain experienced players, right? You could call them older, experienced, whatever you want to call them. And in this case, he's now working with the players that at one point were their youngsters or developing players. Now, like I said, Cuadrado, James, now they are his vets, his senior players. How can these players help this Colombia side move forward into what's this new process?
Yeah, it's important. And like I mentioned, I think that if you look at just the names of call-ups, a lot of people are like, why is James on the list? And why is Jerry Mina or Davinson Sanchez on the list? And I'm like, listen, man, like, this is not a friendly, this is not just a regular game. This is the start of a World Cup process. And with that comes the trials and tribulations of needing people that have been around, needing maturity in the locker room, whether or not people say James is or not the mature guy, but it is vital to have that, because you don't know in a certain pressure moment who you might need to call on to get you out of a funk. And that's just how it comes down to it in qualifying for a World Cup. You can't just go into it and say, we're going to throw all the kids in from the beginning. Now, I like the fact that he called these players up, even not having too much, you know, rhythm right now in their club teams, because if you see these first few games that they're not panning out to what you need, then it's a lot easier for you to say, okay, you know what, guys, thank you. Push them to the side a little bit and bring these younger guys in and see what they could offer. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to qualify and then have an idea of what that best squad may be in 2026 to bring here to the States for the tournament. So I think that those players are important. And I think James has gone through a bit of a humbling in his trajectory and career. I think Cuadrado is one of those guys that he's just a locker room guy. He's a personable guy. He's friends with, it seems like, everybody, who, in my opinion, is the captain of the team and still has a lot to offer, still plays well in where he does in Italy. Mina and Sanchez, maybe not so much, but again, like, you don't know in any moment, maybe on the road, maybe sometime in Barranquilla, that you're going to need to count on these guys. I don't think, if I'm looking at the list, I think the only one that deserves to be a starter is Cuadrado, and that's probably still even a little debatable given the talent that they have. But I mean, if you have a guy like James coming off the bench in a tie game in a 60th minute, a guy like Juan Fernando Quintero coming off the bench, I mean, these are guys that have played World Cups. Obviously, James has had one of the best World Cups ever. So you have that experience, and why wouldn't you want that? It's such a weird conversation around these players that it just doesn't make sense that people are analyzing the now and not looking at the long-term goal. And the long-term goal is, you need these veteran leaders. I don't think you've really seen teams progress in qualifiers and in World Cups without having veteran leadership. It's just that simple, because it's such a high pressure situation. When like you said, when James and them were running it up in 2014, which is why I wore this jersey, for good energy and good vibes. When they were running up in 2014, they were the ones looking up to the Mario Yepes, to the Mondragon, who was there just chilling. You know what I mean? And you need to kind of have the young players have that. You know, to the young players, James and Cuadrado and Mina are their pibes and their Tino Asprijas and their Rincons, and it's a progression. So it's important to have them in. And listen, man, you know how I am. I'm a big fan of James. I've defended him for a while. I was watching the Sao Paulo game in Sudamericana. He comes off the bench. He has a great assist. He has a few great balls in the area that could have been goals to win the game. And then he goes and misses the PK, decisive PK, and they lose. But I always say with these players, when you have a certain amount of talent, it doesn't get lost. I think it's more on the discipline and the being bought in, which is what James's problem has always been. But at the end of the day, with some players, when they put this shirt on, when they put their national team shirt on, they're different players, either if it's good or bad. And for the most part, James, we've seen, has been more good than bad with this shirt. So I'm all in for having them there, and I think they could give the new players a lot.
It's crazy to think that fantastic World Cup that Colombia had, and James in particular, is almost 10 years ago now. It's crazy. Talk to me about what new guys you're interested in seeing. What new players are you interested in seeing, and what they can bring to this cafetero side?
I'm going to start from the back. I've always kind of talked about Carlos Cuesta being like the next guy up in defense. I think he's very smart in the way that he goes about his career. He's obviously playing overseas and doing his thing, but he's very dedicated to the craft. And I think that his physique kind of blends him to be that Jerry Mina type of player, where he could be a kind of a threat on set pieces, but he's just a solid defender. And I think having him and Lukumi, who know each other and played in clubs together, I think that's just a great pairing to have, to move from the Mina and Sanchez, who just recently have not been cutting it with La Selección, and then in their club situations, Lord knows what's going on there. So that's one thing for me. I'm very happy to see Santiago Arias back on the list. Obviously, devastating injury. I think they played against Venezuela when he actually tore his knee up. Now playing in FC Cincinnati, which is hilarious, to the point that I was saying earlier about listening to commentary in Colombia. I heard a prominent journalist talking about why Santiago Arias on the list, and calling for all these local players. And I'm like, and I know from, maybe it's because I watch a lot more MLS now than a lot of other things, but the leagues in South America are just not it right now. They're not that good. The domestic players are not. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of talent there, and there is, because I do still watch the Colombian league. But I'm like, Santiago Arias has been great since he's gotten to Cincinnati. They're the best team in the league right now. He's in a good moment. That's literally all you need to get called up. And he's always was good when he was with La Selección. So I'm happy to see him back on the list. If he could continue and, getting these legs back under him like he has been, amazing. He's going to be a good person to have going forward. So I'm happy for that. In the midfield, the Rios is an interesting player, because a lot of people are like, who is this guy playing down in Brazil? And which is funny, because he came in to be Edward Atuesta's kind of not like replacement, but kind of like to help when Atuesta got hurt. And Atuesta was one of those players that when he was here in LA, he was getting those looks, and we're like, Atuesta needs to be in the selection. Like, he needs to be part of the cycle. Then he tears up his knee, and then Rios comes in and has been playing well. And now he's getting a look. So I don't know if he gets a lot of time, but I think it's just good to get somebody like that in the fold and see what he could offer, because, playing down in Palmeiras is not an easy task. A team that's, fighting for Libertadores and playing well. So that's the one player that I think people may just look over and be like, hey, like whatever, but keep an eye on the name. Carrascal is I think probably the most, besides Lucho, maybe the most creative player we have on the ball right now. Just in terms of speed, in terms of decision making, in terms of, I think, risk. Like, he's not scared to go one-on-one with anybody. And that's the problem. Colombia got stagnant with having James and Quintero, because they're creative players, but they're not one-on-one. It's more mental. It's more 2 steps ahead and knowing what they're going to do and move the ball around that way. Whereas, like, you need people like Lucho, you need people like Carrascal, and even Cuadrado, when he's on his game, they're going to go right at people and try to go right by them. So that's that. And I'll go with, obviously, Duran. Like, Duran is an incredible player, scoring with Aston Villa now. You just being able to see his progression. I am a little skeptical because he is young, but I don't want, and the same thing I said with Yasser Asprilla, who's not on the list, but I don't want him to get thrown into the fire right away and then it be like, oh, he's not producing. I think we have the luxury, I want to say that cautiously, to let him progress little by little and with La Selección and be able to be a force. And who knows, maybe when 2026 comes, he's the starter without a doubt. But it's a player that, has all the quality. I think more people than not know this now because of where he's playing and his trajectory and his profile. So that's one player. And for me, the most important player besides Lucho, who is obviously, Colombia's best player right now, is Sinisterra. I think Sinisterra is a great player. I think he's very he's the same like Carrasco. He's not nervous to go one-on-one with people. He's very fast, but he's very direct. He doesn't mess around with the ball too much. He's very direct to the area. In the friendly against Mexico that was up in Northern California, he came in and switched the game for Colombia at halftime right away. And he's a threat. And I think he's one of those players that is like, this is a moment. I see the opportunity. I'm hungry. And if I play to my ability, I could be a sure starting 11 person day in and day out. So right now, that's probably the guy I'm looking forward to the most, is seeing Sinisterra.
All right. Now, based on what we know now, right? You know who's been called up, and you know kind of the situation that's going on with your selección. And obviously, we know a little bit here and there from all the other selecciones. Going into 2026, where do you see Colombia realistically being in the final standings for this conmebol cycle?
I've probably said this to you a handful of times, on camera, off camera. Colombia should be the third best team in South America based on talent. I feel like for the past amount of time they should be. But the problem with them is always the same thing, where they get stagnant, they get into their own head, they can't score, they can't do certain things. And you're like, why is the talent pool so rich and the quality is not the same? And I think that we have to take a step back as Colombians, or just as analysts of the game, and say, hey, that doesn't necessarily equate. One thing is not the other all the time. And if you're not showing it, then you're not going to get that respect. And I think that they've been humbled, like I said earlier, James. Them as a whole federation, they've been humbled to say, hey, this is a great team and we know they're dangerous, but let's see it. Let's see it, because we haven't seen it the way that it should be. So if I'm being realistic, I could say 4 or 5. I could still see somebody like Uruguay being like that, like fighting for that third spot. Obviously, Peru's going to come in hot and still, try to make another run. But you look at the bottom of the table, or the theoretical bottom of the table, I'm like, Venezuela I look at the roster, I'm like, okay. Ecuador should probably still be pretty decent. But then everybody else, I'm like Paraguay, Bolivia. But once again, like to our point, these are the games that you go to these countries and you start dropping points in because of all the factors, whatever the case may be. And that's when things start getting complicated. So if I had to really, really pick a spot for them, I'd probably say in that 4 or 5 range, which, hey, it gets us into the World Cup.
Right. And that, like you said in the beginning, that's all you care about at the end of the day. Getting to first or second place isn't going to give you any extra point in the World Cup or anything like that. So it doesn't matter. Just getting there is the point. Now, I think you already touched a little bit on this, but I want to know, because there's 6.5 spots. I want to know who you really think is out. Like 3 teams that you're saying, nah, they're not, forget about it.
If I had to say, I would probably go, sorry to our buddies, I'd go Bolivia. I want to say, this might be controversial, I want to say Chile, but there's something about them sometimes that they get interesting. I don't know. I feel like the transition for them might be a little tougher than they thought it would be. So I'm going to throw them in there for the hell of it. And then I'm going to go with Venezuela, because I was looking at the roster, because obviously that's the first opponent for Colombia. And I'm like, nothing really jumps out. Like it's a talented roster, don't get me wrong, but nothing jumps out to me to say that in this qualifying stage, they're going to be able to hang with some of these teams the way that you need to get up there. And once you start dropping a few of those points, you start bringing the calculator on. You're like, oh, this is going to get crazy. And we know, like, Brazil and Argentina, majority of South America counts those as losses anyways. Like, there's very few teams that go there and get results in either of those countries. So not to say that they can't be beaten, because obviously they could. And those 2 teams are probably going through their own transitions and injuries too. But I will go with those 3: Chile, Bolivia, and Venezuela. And I hope that does not come back to bite me whenever it does.
No, I mean, I think those are all solid choices. I think Bolivia, for obvious reasons, I think they just can't get it done away from home, to be honest with you. Venezuela, I think I would have maybe gave him a fighting chance when they had Peckerman as coach, but then he dropped out. So I feel like there's no process there. The federation is just, I don't know what they're doing, to be honest with you. Then Chile, I think that they're still trying to figure out how to move on from Vidal and Alexis and that golden generation. But I mean, that that 6.5 spot is so up in the air, and that's the beauty of conmebol. You know, you could have Ecuador, you could have Colombia, you could have Peru, you could have Chile, Paraguay, all fighting for that spot. At the end of the day, we never know, but that's the beauty of it. And yeah, again, Andy, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for, you know, giving us your insight into this Colombia side and what's coming up. I want to give you this last minute to, you know, let the people know where they can find you and your work, and so they can follow you.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you, man. One person I didn't mention was Cucho Hernandez. To my MLS fans and MLS haters, playing great in Columbus. I think he needs to be on the radar if he's not, and I know he is because I've talked to him and he's told me he's talked to Nestor Lozano as well. He needs to be in the mix because I think that's a very, very good player to have in the fold. But appreciate you, man. Yeah, Yahoo Sports. I'll be covering the home stretch for MLS. It's kind of weird because I guess we won't be doing too much U.S. stuff since they don't have to qualify, but we'll always be keeping an eye on the U.S., seeing what those national teams are doing. Mexico, who I've been, I guess, kind of following a lot more closely now as well. Yeah, and just writing, editing, and doing all that good stuff, getting ready for a busy season. So Andy_Deossa on Twitter. Yahoo Sports is where my stuff is. And Diego, as always, I appreciate you. Vamos a tomar guarito, perdemos, ganamos, de tomar guaro se festeja y todo bien, todo bonito.
Let's go, let's go. Again, thank you, Andy, and thank to all of you. We'll have all of the CONMEBOL nations right here to, you know, break it down for you guys right before the World Cup qualifiers start. Thank you again. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. See y'all later.